right, welcome back to the DTVC Extra podcast. In this episode, we're going to continue our look at the Superman series with Superman 3 and Supergirl. So kind of continuing in chronological order, but also I think these two kind of pair well together in terms of, looking at them. I think, 1 and 2 just naturally fit together. And I think these two fit together as well, especially if you're going to include Supergirl, right? I think this is the place to include it. So before I get into that, one of the things I realized last time was that I didn't really get into the origin of Superman himself, or sort of how Superman was created. And I'm not going to get too much into it here just because I think it could kind of bog down the episode a little bit to just go way into Superman, how he was created and all of that. But in reading about it, it was interesting to discover, sort of how Superman gets his powers, how all of that kind of stuff comes to be. And of course, these are just kind of basic things that I picked up Wikipedia and places like that. So it's, maybe some of the things I have aren't completely correct, but in the last episode I talked about, in the last DTVC Extra episode, I talked about how Superman the film was kind of the archetype for what comic book movies ended up becoming. And one of the things I didn't realize is that Superman himself is the archetype, right, for what we think of as superheroes. The cape, the different superpowers, the secret identity, all of that, the outfit, right, the skin-tight outfit, all of that stuff is kind of like what we expect with superheroes. And, superheroes that come after, right, whether it's, Captain Marvel, who becomes Shazam, Captain America, Batman, they kind of all take on elements of that. And so, in looking at the history of it, the two creators, right, Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, they met in high school, and they're kind of playing around with ideas. And Siegel was the writer, Shuster was the artist, and Superman was originally a villain because at that time, in the 30s, a lot of times it was the villain that had the superpowers, and it was a human hero that had to overcome that. And so they had created a guy named Superman who had like the ability to control people's minds and things like that. And then usually, like, again, you think about like Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon, right? They would be overcoming a supervillain. So the idea of the hero having superpowers was a relatively new thing. But when they started coming up with that idea of Superman being the one with the superpowers, when they would shop it to newspapers for syndication, they looked at it as like, well, this isn't big enough for us, right? You got to keep making it bigger. And that's how Superman keeps getting powers, is that they just kept adding things on to make him bigger and kind of more larger than life. And even the backstory, right? They kept kind of tweaking that a bit to make it as fantastic as possible. The look, all of those things, they kind of just kept adding things on until eventually they had it. And even then, it was, the newspapers didn't really want it, right? They ended up having to sell it to DC. Then I guess I'm trying to think how the history of that went, where when they become Detective Comics, it was sort of they were working there because they were working for the originator of DC. Because they needed some money somewhere, but they still didn't give them Superman when they got that job. It wasn't until the company had some outside investors who came in and ended up taking it over because the guy who was running at the time couldn't pay his bills. He wasn't even paying them, Shuster and Siegel. They weren't getting paid regularly, but it was almost like, all right, at least we're getting paid somewhere, so we'll do that. But they were afraid to give him Superman. They didn't want someone else to have Superman. I don't know if you heard that bang there. My cat just knocked something over, but they didn't want to give him Superman. So these two investors take over when he goes bankrupt, and they create DC Comics, and they convince Siegel and Shuster to give them Superman when they create Action Comics, and that's sort of how that happens. But one of the things, of course, is that the continuity, right? We take for granted canon and those kinds of elements now, but at the time it was just new writers would take in and they would give Superman different powers, and I was like, okay, well, we need to come up with consistent powers. We need to come up with a consistent backstory. All of those kinds of things. And so, it's interesting, even just thinking about the movies, right? For the first and second movies, how they sort of add elements in. For example, the S was supposed to be an S for super, right? For Superman. But, then Marlon Brando comes up with the idea that, well, no, what if the S is the crest, right? The family crest, the L family crest. So, even within that, right, they're sort of coming up with ideas that the comic books ends up taking later. So, it's an interesting thing, right? Because of course now we think of like canon and story continuity and all of these kinds of things that in the 30s, which yes, the 30s are a long time ago now, but for myself, thinking about growing up in the 80s, right, and my grandparents being born in the 20s, the 30s didn't seem as long ago, and it is a relatively new phenomenon, like the comic book idea. But Superman was the originator of a lot of it, which I think is something that's always interesting, always important to keep in mind, because I think, especially with DC, with how it's flipped, right? The Batman has sort of become Batman's become the number one, and Superman the number two. But Superman has managed to stay the number two, despite the issues that came up with Superman. Because you think about it in the 60s, right? When Marvel starts to really take off, they're creating all of these flawed characters, right? Spider-Man has a lot of flaws. Iron Man has flaws. Hulk in particular, right? We know Hulk has a ton of flaws. But even like the Fantastic Four, right? Like each character has their own thing that they bring to the table, but they're not like by themselves. Like, they can't do all of the things that Superman can do. It's one of the interesting things, I guess, when I think about like DC at that time and sort of how they created characters versus what Marvel did in the 60s with all the characters that they created. It's almost like the people with superpowers were aliens, or they're from other lands, right? So Superman's from another planet. Wonder Woman is from, within the, she's from Earth, but she's from a hidden, almost like godlike area, right? I guess it was Amazonia in the comics, or Paradise Island in the original comics, and then it becomes Themyscira, I think is what they call it now. But then it's like the human would be like Batman, who he's a human character, but he has like gadgets and things like that. But it's almost like this idea that humans aren't equipped to have special powers. Flash would be an exception to that. I guess Green Lantern would be an exception. But a lot of those bigger characters, right? They're either from other lands, and they have all kinds of different special powers. But it's like almost like humans aren't equipped to handle having special powers. So that's really kind of the message that I kind of feel like I was seeing in those early DC comics. And again, you can make the point that, like, again, right, Green Lantern, right, Hal Jordan, he gets powers from outer space, but they're trusted to a special human to have them. And then Flash, again, he is an enhanced human, right, but he doesn't have all superpowers, right? He just has the ability to run really fast. So he's kind of different in that sense. He's closer to what we think of like with the Marvel heroes, right, where all of them have like maybe one or two powers that they can do. But then they have a lot of vulnerabilities as well. They always talked about that, right? That their fear was they didn't want to create a Superman where you had to create kryptonite. They had to invent something, right, to be a vulnerability. And it's interesting, even then, you think of Marvel, when Marvel was creating their own Superman, it's Captain America. And Captain America, while he was an enhanced human being, he didn't have all the powers that Superman had. So even at that time, even in the 40s, they were thinking in those ways. It's different from DC, where they're sort of they create Superman, who's like a god on Earth. But again, he's sort of the prototype of what we think of as superheroes after. So even Marvel, when they're creating superheroes after, they still have a lot of capes, right? They still have a lot of skin tight suits. So they still have the secret identities, right? So they're still following all of the rest of the roadmap that Superman gave us, and they're just sort of tweaking certain pieces here or there. So that getting us now to Superman 3, I think there's another sort of archetype or I don't know what it would say. There's another like type of comic book movie that they create here with Superman 3 that I think for us as fans of comic books, it's something that we're used to. It's this idea that comic book heroes, like you get the superhero, but you don't get any villains from the comic book. You don't get other things from the comic book. They sort of, whoever's making the movie creates all of these new baddies to go along with it, right? So think of like the Spider-Man TV series. They said of the Spider-Man TV series that they didn't want to use any of Spider-Man's villains gallery because they didn't have the special effects budget, right, to create, like, say, like a Dr. Octopus or a Vulture or a Lizard or something like that and make it look good on screen. Doesn't explain why they don't have Kingpin, but I digress. Right? They just didn't do it, right? They didn't do any of that. The Incredible Hulk series, right? Remember, none of the villains, right, from the Hulk series are showing up in the Hulk TV series or with Wonder Woman or any of those. So there's that element of it. But even like with comic book movies that kind of come after Superman 3, the Batman ones, of course, stay consistent in having villains in them. But obviously, the Punisher, with Dolph Lundgren. They don't even use the Punisher skull in making the movie, right? They want it to be so divorced from the comic books. At least with Captain America, he does fight Red Skull, so at least you have that baddie there. But it's kind of a common thing. This Superman 3 that we see here, I think for me as a comic book fan, it does make me feel a little bit of like, oh, I just, remember all of these times where comic book movies, it was like you had a comic book character, but you pulled everything else out of the comic book that we liked so much. So I think it's going to be interesting to get stuck in here because this is also where the franchise turns on us here, right? So we get two very successful outings here with 1 and 2. And even though I had nits to pick or I had bones to pick with the second one, it is still a very successful movie. And, Warner had greenlighted doing a third one based off the initial, I think the opening weekend of the second one. So I think the Salkinds knew they were going to make a third one here. But they also start to see, I don't say kind of, they start to see the limitations of their budget when they make number 3. Recently, I want to say it was 2007, I think it was, a document surfaced of an 8-page treatment that Ilya Salkind had written as an idea for a third, for what the third Superman movie was going to be. Also, Richard Donner had talked about making a third and fourth movie. He'd already had those planned out before he was, I don't know if he was fired, as we talked about in the last episode. With Superman 2, it's a question of whether he was actually fired or if it was more like he didn't want to work with Pierre Spengler, my first forgotten name already here, Pierre Spengler, but he didn't want to work with Pierre Spengler, and that was a condition of him continuing. And the Salkinds were like, well, no, Spengler's our friend, we want to keep working with him. So it's a question of whether Donner was fired or if it was more like they couldn't come to an agreement on him coming back for 3 and 4. But he had an idea that part 3 was going to have Brainiac. So probably, I don't know if you'd say he's the second most famous villain or third most famous. I don't even know where you rank, Superman villains. He doesn't quite have the rogues gallery that, say, like Batman has or Spider-Man, but he's got some names, right? So, obviously Lex Luthor is the big one. He's the one that you always expect. And then they bring in Zod, who I guess Zod would have been, I think he was introduced in 61 as a baddie when they started introducing the Phantom Zone villains. And so Zod would have been one of those. But that's who they kind of use as their second biggest one. But then Brainiac, I guess Brainiac might be your third. You've also got Bizarro Superman, Mr. I'll see if I can pronounce this right. It's Mixoplictic or something like that. Mixerplictic, but you know who I'm talking about, right? He's another famous one at that time. Also, Darkseid, I think, is introduced in 71. So another famous Superman baddie that they could have had there. But Brainiac is probably the one, right? He would be your next one. You think of in terms of Superman's influence on the lexicon or on the zeitgeist, right? The different ways that he's influenced that. Brainiac is a term that exists, right? Well, that's we still use that term, calling somebody, if somebody thinks they're smart or whatever, you're calling them a brainiac, right? So that expression has existed. So that he probably would have been a good third villain. So that was Donner's idea. But getting back to, I kind of got sidetracked here about this document that was released in 2007 that showed Ilya Salkind's treatment, his 8-page treatment for what he wanted Superman 3 to be. It was going to involve Brainiac, Supergirl, and Mr. Mixoplictic. I'm just going to kind of butcher it, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But the idea was that Supergirl ends up on a planet with Brainiac, and Brainiac raises her, and then I guess falls in love with her, and she comes and finds Superman, and they kind of fall in love together, because I guess they're not cousins, they're just fellow Kryptonians. I think most of the lexicon now has her, or much of the canon of the story, whatever, the background has her as being a cousin of Superman. So they're both of the family of El, I guess you could say. But anyway, that was the plan, and the idea was supposed to be that Brainiac comes to Earth, Superman, he gets his mind controlled by Brainiac and starts doing villainous things. And then, Mr. Mixoplictic shows up and he starts messing with Superman. And then Superman uses him to defeat Brainiac. That's the idea. And so, I guess the Warners and also even that kind of stuff, they looked at this and said, we don't have the money for this. And the Salkinds were starting to realize that Superman is becoming too big for what their budget would allow. And so they start looking at maybe having Dino De Laurentiis get involved, that he could potentially buy it, which, I can't even imagine how much money De Laurentiis has, Obviously, he was involved in like the Conan films, but also I think he owns Napoli, the soccer club or the football club in Italy. So it definitely a lot of money there. But now of course we would look at it as like the only money that would really manage a Superman movie is like a multinational conglomerate like Warner, like Disney, Marvel, that kind of thing. But that's what we're in the 80s, right? We were still at a time where multi-million-dollar producers could figure out ways to make these movies. But even then, they were starting to see the limitations of what they had involved. When Tim Burton starts doing his Batman movies, those are fully backed by Warner Brothers Studios. So when he makes that second one, all of his demands for sets and all those kinds of things are met by Warner Brothers. The Salkinds didn't really have that at the time. They were being distributed by Warner Brothers, and Warner was backing in some ways financially, but not to the same extent. So they had to figure out how they were going to make Superman 3 on the cheap. And even from a budget standpoint here, right? When you think of the first two Superman movies are around 55 million a piece, and I'm trying to think with that is if that's like combined for both of them and divided in half, because remember they shot most of both of them together, like how they manage that. But Superman 3 comes in at 39 million, right? So it's a good 15 million less than those two, which is a good amount of money at that time, right? You could have used that for a lot of different things. So I guess some of the ideas that they were thinking of, like having Brainiac, and of course, again, the Salkinds, again, Ilya Salkind has this really grand idea for what they want to make for the movie, but I feel like there probably could have been a happy medium between this grand idea on this 8-page treatment that was unearthed in 2007 and what we end up getting. Because what we end up getting is a little bit interesting. It's almost like these non-fully fleshed ideas. They wanted to get Richard Pryor involved. Richard Pryor had said in a Carson interview that he'd like to be in one of the movies, and they thought, hey, let's get Richard Pryor in here. I think they could have. I like his character. I think he's a lot of fun in this. But they could have gone all out. They could have made him Brainiac instead of teased this idea that he could or couldn't be Brainiac, or that almost like he's like Brainiac Light is what what they do with that character. They can't get Gene Hackman again. Gene Hackman's out. So they get Robert Vaughn as another billionaire, who's another billionaire baddie who's sort of involved in this kind of thing. But then also, they have Bizarro Superman Light, right, where Christopher Reeves kind of has a fight with himself. And I think it's that scene in general that kind of gets Christopher Reeve involved with this one, because he was kind of iffy about coming back to do another Superman movie as well. So there are a few different other machinations that come up here, especially like the Lana Lang versus Lois Lane thing. But why don't I do a quick synopsis here, and then we'll kind of break down sort of what this one's about. So from a synopsis standpoint, it's sort of, I guess it kind of picks up where Superman 2 leaves off, but we're not sure exactly how far in the future. Maybe it's a few years in the future, something like that. But Lois is going to Bermuda on vacation, and Clark decides he's going to go back to Smallville with Jimmy Olsen to do a report on his class reunion. The class reunion is interesting because it's like I guess it's like the 1965 class reunion, so that means this would take place in 85. That's possible. We don't know, because then there's other things that happen in the movie. Like there's a scene of the Olympics, which I think would have been 1984 Olympics. There's the timeline doesn't quite make sense in a lot of different ways. But anyway, that's the idea. It's the 1965, the class of 65, I guess 20th reunion. So he goes back and he meets Annette O'Toole playing Lana Lang, and they kind of he finds out she's a recent divorcee. So Clark kind of has a thing with her. At the same time, Superman's kind of saving the day on different things. And then on a different story track, Richard Pryor, he's at the unemployment agency, and he ends up, because he's run out of time for his unemployment, he learns how to code and gets a job with Robert Vaughn's company as a coder, and he discovers a way to siphon off like half-cent roundups that normally would, the half cent here or there that normally gets lost in the system. He's found a way to grab those and make himself a lot of money. This draws the attention of Robert Vaughn, who is looking for ways to sort of play with computers to make himself richer. And so they team up, and they have this plan. I guess there's a satellite that can control the weather, and because of the country of Colombia is not playing ball with Vaughn and his I guess, I don't know, his syndicate that wants to control all of the coffee prices. He unleashes a big weather storm on him, and it seems like it's going to be a problem until Superman saves the day, which I don't know if this is a different cut that I saw, but in the version that I was watching, it seemed like it was all done off screen. It was just sort of like, it was going to be a problem, but then Superman, whatever. And then they come up with this idea of like recreating kryptonite for him, and Richard Pryor can't figure out, like, when he analyzes the composition of kryptonite, something is like, I guess, like 0.5% that's listed as unknown. So he just puts in tar, like what you get in your cigarettes. And when Superman gets this kryptonite, it just causes him to act like a jerk. And turns him into Jerk Superman. And Jerk Superman is out causing problems while Robert Vaughn is collecting all of the oil tankers in the world and creating his own oil embargo to control oil prices. So the planet is going to shit, right? With between the oil issues and Superman being a jerk. And at some point, Superman, in being a jerk, he goes to a junkyard and Clark splits off from the jerk Superman, and they fight it out, and they end up fighting, and eventually he's able to defeat this Superman and then go to defeat the baddies who, at this time, Richard Pryor has had Robert Vaughn give him the money to create this supercomputer. And the supercomputer actually, causes some issues for fighting Superman, but, Richard Pryor helps out because he kind of has a change of heart, and eventually they defeat Robert Vaughn and Robert Vaughn's sister and whoever else, and everybody lives happily ever after. So that's essentially the movie. This is one that I saw relatively recently with my wife, with Jen. We were just sort of looking at that movie and thought we would both enjoy watching. So I think she said she saw both 2 and 3 in the theater. She definitely remembered seeing 3 in the theater. She couldn't remember about 2, and I hadn't seen 3 in forever. So I thought, okay, let's watch these. Let's watch number 3 together. And by itself, on its own, without the context of 1 and 2 first, 3 feels like a fun movie. It's definitely bonkers. It's definitely off the wall. I mean, you get this opening, campy sequence that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but it tells you that you're in for a different kind of Superman movie, right? You're not showing up with like space in the background and these credits swooping in. No, it's some goofy like thing where it's goofy and campy, but yet people are also close to dying in it. Like a guy is almost drowning in a guy gets into an accident and knocks a hydrant off the pavement, and suddenly water is filling his car, and Superman's got to like rescue him before he drowns in his car. And so it's like, it's campy and goofy, but yet like kind of deaths happening around as well. Which it's an interesting thing, because I was reading that I guess the original script was this campy. So the writers of the original script were here in this one as well, and I guess so it's the Newmans, David Newman and David and Leslie Newman. So they had originally written Superman 1 and 2, and then when Donner took over, he had his friend Tom Mankiewicz punch the script up a bit and take some of the camp out. So like there's a sequence where Superman was supposed to be chasing Lex Luthor in Metropolis, and he thinks he's found him, and he grabs him, and it ends up being Telly Savalas, right? Because Lex Luthor's bald, and Savalas turns around and says, "Hey, who loves you, baby?" or something like that. Who loves So a lot of that stuff was written out. Well, this is completely unfettered Newman's writing this, and Lester was also Richard Lester, who was directing this one. He was also kind of more in line of like camp offbeat stuff when he was a director. So, the first 2 movies were more Donner's vision, but then, right, that, you've got Lester taking over some, but, yes, they were originally the Newman script that Mankiewicz had completely changed around. This time it's completely unfettered Newman's, unfettered Lester, so we get like this massive amount of camp. And I could understand that if I was a fan of seeing the first, because I know seeing the first 2 back to back like this and then coming in for number 3, it definitely doesn't come off as well as it did when we watched it as a one-off, where we had a lot of fun with it as that one-off. And which is a very interesting thing, right? That a movie could exist in 2 ways, right? That it exists as part of this series, and as part of this series, it doesn't come off as well. But by itself, it's kind of this goofy concept of Superman. So there's that, which when you think about other Part 3s, right? So you think of like Iron Man Part 3, for example, where it's almost like they knew what this movie was. And while Iron Man Part 3 maybe isn't as strong as 1 and 2, it definitely isn't Superman 3, right? And it definitely, and part of why, it pulls in over $1 billion. I should think of some other ones. I mean, obviously Captain America, right? They go the Civil War route with that one, which is a completely different thing. But in a way, it's almost what the idea that Ilya Salkind had for this movie, in the sense that it's big, right? It has a lot of other heroes in it. Superman 3 was supposed to have, I guess, at least would have had Supergirl in it, but also more villains, more supervillains as well, which actually Civil War doesn't have any supervillains. It's more just the heroes fighting with each other, which is really interesting concept, but it works really well, right? That's another one that's a $1 billion earner. Obviously, like the Spider-Man series, right? Spider-Man 3 is kind of the weaker of those, but it would have been it still did well enough that you could say, okay, we're going to do another Spider-Man movie, and it was really more, right, just the fact that they had that delay in making it that forced them to reboot the series, right, with Andrew Garfield, because they weren't originally going to do that. But Spider-Man 3 turns in a lot of money. It does really well. So even if it was critically not as exciting as the first two, it did what you needed it to do to get it there. We talked about, we were talking about the Star Trek movies, right? That movie, the third Star Trek movie, was really a solid get me over to number 4 movie that this movie wasn't. And I do think there was a sense that, having seen what happened with Superman 3, that I think Star Trek 3 saw that and said, okay, or the people making Star Trek 3, with Leonard Nimoy, they saw what happened with Superman 3 and thought, okay, let's just get 3 done so that we can get to 4 in a way that, like, okay, let's not screw it up, I guess, is really what, and then they can go bigger with number 4, which I think is, I think that's always in a way, this movie was sort of that warning. I think with the Batman series, it's interesting because you change directors, just like this one changed, right, to Lester from Donner. Even though Lester had a part in Part 2, it's really, this is the first time we're doing Lester. And, we go from Burton to Schumacher when we do, Batman Returns to Batman Forever. It definitely is a different feel, right? It's a different kind of movie. And there is a point to be made, too, that when we hit Batman Forever, that a little bit of fatigue had set in. But I think also, too, Batman Returns was such a fantastic movie. It was just so, like between the sets and the performances and everything that you get in that movie, that 3 was going to be a letdown. But I also think, too, Schumacher, part of the reason why people dislike Batman and Robin so much is I think Schumacher was also working from this playbook of let's make 3 good enough to get us to 4, right? It's like, okay, new directors taking over. Let's not get too crazy with anything here. So we'll get the stars that we should expect to play the bad guys. Val Kilmer, he wants to be Batman. He's a big enough star. We can do that. So they don't really do anything too crazy compared to when we get to number 4, right? Where it definitely is a little bit more over the top, and that's where people start to have problems with the series, and that's it. It's kind of done, and they rebooted again with Christopher Nolan. And there's the other thing, too, that we could say about that second Batman series and the Spider-Man series, the first 3 Spider-Mans, is that you have consistent directors there, right? You've got you've got Sam Raimi with the 3 Spider-Mans. You've got Christopher Nolan, right? Christopher Nolan with the 3 Batmans, and of course also with those you have the same stars with all of them. So you've got Tobey Maguire with all 3. You've got Christian Bale with all 3, and I think that consistency is important. I think that plays a really strong role in getting us to having 3 consistent movies there with those. Again, I don't always care as much for those Christopher Nolan ones, I think, as other people do, but I can't deny the fact that they were solid, they turned in really good numbers, and that they are ones that people really appreciate and really enjoy. I know a lot of people, if you look on Letterboxd and you look at those 3 Christopher Nolans, especially number 2, right, you see a lot of 4 and 5 stars there. So people really resonated with those, and I think part of that is that consistency. So with this movie here, I never really considered before how much we were losing that consistency by having, new it doesn't seem like we've got new writers, but we do, right? Because we don't have Donner and Mankiewicz, altering the scripts there. So that's a big piece of this that we miss. And I think with the Marvel movies, and I think one of the things, I don't know if it was Quentin Tarantino, when asked if he would do a Marvel movie, he's like, no, I wouldn't do a Marvel movie because you're essentially just a hired gun when you do a Marvel movie. And I think that's an important piece to consider too, with how the Marvel movies have been consistent, especially between like phase 1, 2, and 3, that builds up to that massive Avengers Endgame that just did so well financially. That was, a very controlled and concerted sort of effort to make the movies consistent throughout. With Marvel, and then when Disney takes over Marvel, they really keeps a very it's a very cohesive process. And I think that's another piece that, Kevin Feige always talks about, how the Superman movies were his inspiration. Well, I think you can look at that and say, like, okay, the Salkinds were not as involved with keeping a consistent vision of if they had gone closer to what Donner wanted for the third movie and played it closer to what Donner was doing, maybe this thing keeps moving consistently. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is like tonally this movie feels completely different from those first two, and in that sense it doesn't fully work on that level. But again, I think when my wife and I watched it, we enjoyed it. There are pieces of it to enjoy. I think Richard Pryor is just fantastic. He's always somebody that I enjoy watching anyway. So that really worked. Richard Pryor was a lot of fun here with his character, even if the character didn't seem to fit Superman. I think it is interesting when you think about how movies are made today versus back then, because I think there would have been a fear that Richard Pryor, who one, he's a comedian, he's not. Yes, he was doing acting roles, but really he was known for his stand-up. And, of course, he's African-American, and major roles were not always given to African-Americans in movies at that time. But if they had decided to make him Brainiac, like he's Brainiac, he comes from outer space, and he's shrinking cities, and he's doing all the stuff that Brainiac does. Or if they made him Mr. Mitsapliktik, whatever, as a comedian, right? And he just sort of shows up as that character and plays that part. But I think Brainiac could have been more fun, because he could have added that sort of the humor to it, but still been this diabolical villain. And I think one of the things he complained about was that he actually was hoping that by being in Superman 3, that it would be a more dramatic role that would have shown movie makers or filmmakers that he could do more dramatic stuff. So if you'd given him Brainiac and let it be Brainiac, I think that would have been an interesting decision, but I think it would have been one that would have paid off and tonally would have kept this thing more in line with the first two movies, which I think would have helped it. The Supergirl decision. So one of the things they said with the Supergirl decision was like, one, yes, obviously the money would have been an issue. Right now you've got like two people that are doing scenes that are flying and things like that. So I guess that would have been a concern. Though we had people flying in the previous one, in Superman 2, right? We had all of the we had Zod and his crew were causing those problems. So I think they could have managed that. But there was this other idea of, well, we want to introduce Supergirl in her own movie as opposed to introduce her in Superman. And nowadays, right, we kind of see that work both ways. That, yes, oftentimes, a character will be introduced in her own movie or their own movie. Like, for example, Captain Marvel was introduced uniquely in her Captain Marvel movie. Whereas with Black Panther, right, Black Panther was introduced in Captain America Civil War. And both of those were really successful, right? Both of those movies worked really well. And I think as they were looking at where they were going to take the Marvel Cinematic Universe after Endgame, when they knew Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. were going to be out from there on, those were two candidates. Of course, Chadwick Boseman unfortunately passed away, and so it kind of eliminated him as being the next Iron Man, perhaps. And I think Captain Marvel, I think Brie Larson could have done it. I think she would have been successful at doing it. This is an area, I think, where Kevin Feige didn't listen to his own instincts and sort of looking at Superman, because Superman 2, Captain Marvel, Brie Larson and her Captain Marvel never had her Superman 2, right? They went from the Captain Marvel movie that was her Superman, and then they went right into, I don't even know, this whole team up thing that she does with the other Marvels, where her role gets diminished. She needed a second movie to really establish her as that one. I mean, they never would have done that with Iron Man, right? They wouldn't have said, okay, here, Robert Downey Jr., you had your first movie. Now the second one's just going to be a bunch of other superheroes coming in here and sort of watering down, your development here. No, they made a whole second Iron Man movie that developed him further. And even if people don't like that movie so much, it did establish him more as Robert Downey Jr. And I think that's one thing that I think they made a mistake on in terms of, now, wanting to, if they were setting it up for Brie Larson to be the next Iron Man, sort of the next anchor of this, it's an area where they missed on that. But anyway, getting back to Superman 3, I think, I think that idea of introducing Supergirl in this, I think it would have worked. I think it would have been great if they had Helen Slater in Superman 3. She's helping out Superman or doing whatever it should. Maybe not exactly Ilya Salkin's vision for it, but I think it would have been something that would have worked. And it would have, I think, also bled into, a more exciting Supergirl movie if they had done that. So, I think even Robert Vaughn, right? It's like they couldn't get Gene Hackman back as Lex Luthor, so they bring in this other guy as like another billionaire. Well, why are you doing that? Why not have him be one of these supervillains? Why not have him be Brainiac or Mr. Mxyzptlk or something like that? Whatever it is. So those elements, and I think again watching this within the context of the other movies, it was. The fact that it was tonally off, but two, the fact that it played on my sensibilities of like, I hate when comic books, they invent characters and it's not really the comic book character that, it's a character, but like nobody else is there that I want, that none of the baddies, none of the other stuff. And so it's one of the things I think that makes, like, for example, the Arrowverse work so well is that, Oliver Queen is fighting, he's fighting Deathstroke, and he's fighting, the Huntress, and characters that we know from the comics. When you start adding in these characters, it just seems weird. And I guess that's a complaint that people had with Iron Man 2, was that Mickey Rourke was not necessarily one baddie, but like a mix of baddies, right? He was Whiplash and Crimson Dynamo, I think. He was a combination of baddies, and people thought that was a little bit much. I liked Mickey Rourke in that movie. I thought it was a lot of fun, but I get that complaint, right? Like Iron Man 2 kind of does that the same way, but I guess fortunately Iron Man 2 had enough going for it that that Superman 3 didn't have. So there's that as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm kind of rambling here at this point, kind of going over the similar territory. I mean, I think if you haven't seen Superman 3 in a long time and you just watch it by itself, I think it can be a lot of fun. But actually, before I kind of wrap up, one other thing I wanted to mention is the Bizarro piece. I don't know why they didn't just go full Bizarro for a baddie as well. There's this like one-off scene where Superman fights himself, and they consider that to be like Bizarro. But if they had actually really had a Bizarro Superman, I think Christopher Reeve, for example, because he was disappointed with how this movie turned out. I think if they had really given him a Bizarro and let him play a Bizarro and maybe like paint his face like a pale color or something like that, and have him do that part. And again, if Robert Vaughn was supposed to be Lex Luthor and they couldn't do Lex Luthor necessarily, but he creates the Bizarro Superman, and if maybe he and Richard Pryor create that Bizarro Superman, that could have been really interesting to have Bizarro out there fighting and a real villain for Superman to fight that we know. We recognize who Bizarro Superman is, and it could have been a lot of fun. And it could have been fun in the way that this campiness that they wanted to make, they could have made it fun like that, especially like if he's, sort of learning about Earth and he's breaking things and stuff like that. But, so there's another area where they kind of give us like a piece of something, but they don't really go all the way with it. Because I think people really liked that scene. I did too. I really liked that scene where Clark Kent fights Superman and they're in the junkyard, they're smashing each other and Superman keeps like putting him through like car crushers and things like that. It was a fun scene, so we could have had more of it, right? I mean, it would have been fun if it was Bizarro Superman who was causing all the issues too, right? If he's the one who's blowing out the torch of the Olympics, if he's the one who's riding the Leaning Tower of Pisa, that would have been more fun, I think, than having an angry Superman doing it. But I don't know. That's just me. But anyway, so yeah, getting back to what I was saying, I think if you haven't seen this in a while, as a one-off, it's really interesting. But also, if you're binging the Supermans like I'm kind of doing here, it definitely feels tonally off. Like you feel something is really different here, and it's going to be interesting when we get into 4 and then number 6. Because, or I guess whatever it is, not number 6. The reboot of 3, the Superman Returns, because it's interesting that they kind of felt like 1 and 2 were sacred and you can't mess with 1 and 2, but 3 is the one that, okay, we'll put Superman Returns on and kind of sort of go back and rewrite history or something. Yeah, it's that kind of movie, right? It's a fascinating entry in the comic book series. The other thing too is that, and I think this is an important thing that the Salkinds want people to remember, is that this movie actually did well financially at the box office. It wasn't the huge earner that the other 2 were. It wasn't, a number 1 box. I mean, I think it may have opened as a number 1 film when it came out. It doesn't quite make the top 10 for the year. It's like just shy of that. But it does like double its market. So the other ones were just like way bigger than that. You're talking about like, I mean, the first one in particular is just such a massive win for them. But this third movie had a better opening weekend than those 2. I think, again, that gets to this whole word of mouth thing, right, that we talk about, is that, once people realized that this Superman movie is a little bit off, they started telling people about it. Other people were like, I'm not going to go see that then. You saw it and you got what you got from it. So, we don't really need to see it anymore. You could make the same point about the Marvels, that the Marvels had a pretty strong opening weekend as well. Not to the level that you want, like in the hundreds of millions, I guess, and it was only like roughly 50 million, but it wasn't anywhere near as bad as, like, for example, that new Crow movie or Madam Web or something like that. I mean, that new Crow movie, it barely, what did it make, like 4.8 million in its first weekend? And the Marvels did about almost 50 million in its opening weekend. So it wasn't so bad, but that word of mouth, can torpedo something, and I think that's what happens with Superman 3. So I think there were enough people that wanted to see it after seeing 1 and 2. They liked it enough that they wanted to see it, but it doesn't do as well as they were hoping. And what ends up happening, right, is that because this movie doesn't do as well, even if it was successful enough, right, that it pulled in a profit, Warner Brothers ends up deciding not to distribute Supergirl, right? They end up saying, okay, we're not doing it. And so Supergirl ends up being in limbo for a little bit, and he ends up getting released by TriStar instead of Warner Brothers. So what we'll take a break here. It's kind of a good lead in here, right? That we'll take a break here and we can pick up where Supergirl picks up. I think so. Yeah. So why don't we do that? We'll take a break here, and then we'll come back. We'll start talking about Supergirl. All right, we are back, and one thing I wanted to touch on quickly before we get into Supergirl, just in terms of Superman 3, I've forgotten to mention the Margot Kidder aspect of Superman 3. She's barely in the movie, right? She's in the very beginning, and then she's at the very end. And one of the things at the very end, because Annette O'Toole's Lana Lang character, she moves to Metropolis, and now she's working at the Daily Planet. So, Lois Lane and Margot Kidder, they see, she sees that Lana has the ring. Superman makes a ring for her out of diamonds, stuff like that. But also, they were trying to make her look like she had a tan from being in, like, where was the Bahamas, I guess she was, or Bermuda or whatever. But they want to make it look like she had a tan, and it made her makeup just look really weird. So there's a lot of stories about what happened there with Margot Kidder. I mean, one was the fact that she was critical of the Salkinds for their treatment of Richard Donner. And the understanding was that this might have been punishment for that. That her getting a reduced role and them going with Annette O'Toole's Lana Lang character was a way to kind of keep her out of the movie. So that was a theory. I think she had mentioned it. She felt like that was the case. It feels very awkward in the scenes that, especially at the very end of the movie when she's in the scenes with Annette O'Toole. It feels like it could be that. I think it was Ilya Salkind had said, well, no, it had nothing to do with that. It was that we felt like we had played out the Lois and Superman thing, and we wanted to introduce this new element in the third movie, which on some levels, I get that. I mean, we talked in the previous episode when we were talking about Superman 1 and 2, how I was like, why don't you just go full out, Superman marries Lois, right? And just go for it that way. Why did you need to feel like it was played out or anything like that? And I guess if they were going to go with this route of Superman and Lois have their thing in Superman 2, and then that's it, then I guess you would maybe need to bring somebody new in and do something fresh. But it is an interesting, I mean, again, it's one of those things that makes this feel tonally off. I mean, there's elements of Lana Lang that I think I appreciated. I think the big one was that she likes Clark Kent, whereas Margot Kidder, right, she doesn't. Oh, no, sorry, not Margot Kidder. Sorry, Lois Lane doesn't like Clark Kent, right? Lois Lane has a thing for Superman, but it's the other way around with Annette O'Toole, right? She's attracted to Clark, and I do think that's an interesting element that I don't think you could have put in the new one, or you could have put in a new one with Lois Lane's character. So it is interesting, but I don't know. I personally think that I could see the Sal Kynes. I could see that being an issue, that they didn't want to work with her because of what happened there, and they wrote her character out. So she does come back for part 4 when we talk about that one in 2 weeks, and part of that is because the Sal Kynes are out, right? They're going to be out after this movie here that we discuss, Supergirl. So maybe that's a good place for us to maybe jump in and get started on that one. Before we do get started on that, recently with my work computer, I see these like clickbaity articles that I'll sometimes click on while I'm taking a break, having a snack or something like that in between tasks. And one of them was top 10 Marvel characters. And when I was looking at it, I noticed that the number 10 was Jean Grey. And then the other 9 there were no other female characters on the top 10 list. And it almost felt like they shoehorned Jean Grey in because they couldn't think of another female character to be in the top 10. And I'll be honest, I didn't even know that. I don't know that I would have considered her a top 10. I mean, other ones that you think of too, like Storm, I don't know that she would be considered a top 10. Or Black Widow. It's one of those things with Marvel where they kind of, Visible Woman, I guess, might be one. But Marvel really doesn't have that same level, that level of female heroes to the same extent. I mean, Captain Marvel, I don't think you put Captain Marvel in the top 10 either. I think you could have. I think if they had done her character right, I think it's Brie Larson's character in the movies. If they'd made a better second movie, I mean, there's also kind of the thing where she's kind of like the Deus Ex Machina in the Infinity War movie, where she just sort of shows up, kind of in there. But yeah, I don't know. I think she would have the potential to be a top 10 character from Marvel, but. And the other thing that was interesting about that top 10 list that I saw was that they had Captain America number 2. So they had Spider-Man, Captain America, then Wolverine and Deadpool, whereas I put Captain America below those. But they also had Black Panther in there. And again, I think he would have been a more recent addition, but I think with how successful the Chadwick Boseman's character was with those movies, that you definitely would put him in there as well. But anyway, I looked for some for DC because I was curious about if my take on DC was the same, right? That I had it as Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern. That's sort of how I had it done out. Now, what was interesting with them too is that I had trouble finding that some lists had villains mixed in. So you'd have like the Joker or Lex Luthor mixed in, which is an interesting thing to think about as well. Because I was trying to think of baddies in the Marvel universe that you would mix in like that. And I mean, I guess Doctor Doom might be the one, but I can't, like when you think of like Thanos, for example, I mean, he was like one of those galactic baddies that they made into a big baddie, right, in these movies. But I don't know that I would put him, I would put Thanos at the same tier as like the Joker or Lex Luthor. So that's an interesting part of it, right, is that DC maybe has, even if they don't have... even if really Batman's the only one that has like the real villains gallery. I mean, I don't know. Flash had a kind of a fun villains gallery as well, but they have some really, really iconic villains in a way that I guess Magneto might be another one that you'd think of for Marvel. I'm sorry, kind of going off the cuff there, but yeah, I mean, that's one piece, right? The DC, even if they don't have the overall villains necessarily that Marvel has completely, they've got some real strong ones there. So there's that one piece. But the other thing I realized is that yes, my numbers were my guess was pretty close at some of the ones I saw. Like it was either Wonder Woman 3, Green Lantern 4, or they'd switch those two, and they'd have Green Lantern 3 and Wonder Woman 4, and then you go into like Flash. I think like Martian Manhunter would be like 9 or 10. But the other interesting fact that I noticed about this was that Supergirl would be in there invariably. So maybe 7th, 8th, something like that. So not quite as high as Wonder Woman, but she would still be in that realm. And I think that's an important thing that you've got with DC, that you've got two really strong female characters there. That, Wonder Woman obviously being a top three, but also Supergirl being that strong. And, obviously I think a big piece of it with Supergirl is that the recent TV series that was successful. And I ended up watching the first episode of that just because I was kind of curious to kind of see what their take was on it. And I think, Melissa Benoist, I think hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly. I think she is a really, like her version of Supergirl, it fits in a modern context in a way that I think the one we're going to be talking about here doesn't fit in a mid 80s modern context. I think it would have been, the way that they had some things that they could do with it based on it being a TV series that a movie probably can't do, where they can kind of have this sort of more I don't know what the term is, like kind of an opening that just kind of meanders a bit more and has backstory and narration and things like that to kind of set it up, that you really couldn't do as much with the movie. I mean, I guess you could have. They could have maybe put together their montage or something like that. But yeah, I could see, why that show lasted 6 seasons and why, how that would, get Supergirl kind of higher up on the list there for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it, right? Is that I think, DC has these two female superheroes that you don't really have equivalents to them in Marvel. Wonder Woman, of course, is a different one altogether because Wonder Woman is I think the part of the reason why she was so successful is that she's created by Professor Marsden, who is. Yes, he's still a man, but I think he wrote a female lead that both women and men would want to read. And he pulls a lot of elements. I mean, obviously the eroticism, the BDSM, and all that kind of stuff is something that, I think even younger kids at that time got a kick out of and enjoyed. But, I mean, to create a female character that has endured for that long, she's almost as old as Batman and Superman. She's right in that realm, and as big as them. Green Lantern also is from around that time as well. But yeah, I think it's a testament to that. And then with Supergirl, I guess with Supergirl, she was created by other writers. Even though when you watch things, they mention Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and I think part of that is because they came up with the whole Superman idea, and so this Supergirl concept is within that idea. But it was another writer who had developed the idea of her with Fawcett Comics when he had created Shazam, or it was Captain Marvel at that time. He had created a female version of Captain Marvel that he was using. And so when he goes to DC, he creates Supergirl as the female version of Superman, and she becomes really successful. People really liked her. And so when we get into the Superman series, when the Salkinds are making Superman, and they're looking to sort of expand that universe that they have, Supergirl was a natural place to go there with that. And I mean, it's interesting because again, like thinking about like Wonder Woman at that time, and them not going with Wonder Woman, or not trying to get Wonder Woman to get her involved at all when she was already established. Linda Carter, I think, would have probably gone on in one of the Superman movies and played Wonder Woman in there and interacted with Superman. And I think it would have been fun to see that happen there. But again, it wasn't going to be. But the Salkinds did have the rights to Supergirl, and I think that's what they were. I think their plan was, they didn't really come out and say this, but I think their plan was, in wanting to spin off into these Supergirl movies, is they knew they were losing stars from the Superman films. So they had already lost Gene Hackman. Christopher Reeves was iffy. It took a lot of work to get him to come back to do the third movie. Margot Kidder, of course, there was the issues that had happened there with her being upset with how Richard Donner was treated. Which, I mean, that was the same reason why Gene Hackman didn't want to come back and do the movie. So they were losing those characters, and I think if there was an idea that if they could spin this off into a new series of movies with Helen Slater as Supergirl, then they can maybe get 3 more movies out of this without having to worry about all the baggage and all the other issues that they were dealing with in the previous 3 films. Unfortunately, right, as we talked about, what happens is that Superman 3 doesn't do as well as Warner was hoping it would, and they shelve Supergirl. And it ends up being re-released by another company. There were other issues in terms of budget with Supergirl as well. Some of the ideas that they had in mind for it. There was issues in terms of Faye Dunaway with her. I guess she was giving them problems on the set. So all kinds of different things that plagued this movie. And it's an interesting addition to the Superman franchise because it is within that universe. It's in that world. The only connection between the two is Jimmy Olsen, right? Was that Mark McClure? Is that the actor name? Probably, again, we should have him written down because, IMDb, I can't always just pop over there and see. But I think that's the name, is Mark McClure. And he played Jimmy Olsen in this new one as well. What's interesting about this movie is that, he's playing this kid who works at the Daily Planet, who is then coming and hanging out with high school kids. So I don't know. It was a weird idea there with that. Again, it's one of the things that the modern TV show doesn't have to worry about as much when they have the character of Supergirl play. Her name was Kara Danvers, and that was the local name she gave herself, but it was Kara Zor-El. She essentially grows up on Earth, and so she's an adult when she's saving the day. She's a young adult, right? She's in her early 20s, but she's still an adult when she's doing things. So if she's getting into romantic entanglements and things like that, they're not so bad, right? And Helen Slater's her she her age would have been enough to be a young adult. She was roughly the same age as Melissa Benoist when she made the movie, but it seemed like she was playing somebody younger, right? They were making Supergirl younger, so it was a little bit off there tonally as well. Why don't I do a quick synopsis here, and then we'll get a little bit deeper into some of my thoughts here on Supergirl. So I guess what happens is that after Krypton is blown up, some other people have some Kryptonians have developed a city called Argo City in inner space. So it's sort of a separate dimension, and included in that is we've got Peter O'Toole. He plays Zaltar. He's kind of the one who created that whole area. Supergirl's mother, Allura, is played by Mia Farrow. Her father, Zor-El, is played by Simon Ward. Peter O'Toole, he's kind of a bit of a rogue within this Argo City, and he has this device called the Omega Hedron that's powering the whole city and keeping everybody alive. And while he's playing around with things, that thing goes flying out of the of Argo City into space. Helen Slater, as Supergirl or Kara Zor-El. She is playing around with the things because he told her to play with them, and so it's partially her fault as well. And she's like, well, you know what? I'm going to go to Earth. I'm going to go track the Omega Hedron. She tracks it to Earth. I'm going to go there and save it, bring it back, and save everybody's lives. So when she gets there, unfortunately, the Omega Hedron has been picked up by Selena, a witch played by Faye Dunaway. And so she uses the power of the Omega Hedron to become this supervillain, take over the world. So while Supergirl is trying to track down the Omega Hedron and find out who has it, she decides to disguise herself as a high school girl, and she's roomed with Lois Lane's younger sister, Lucy Lane, played by Maureen Teefy. And so she's kind of balancing being a high school girl at a prep school that's kind of just outside of Chicago. She's sort of balancing those needs with going out and trying to find this Omega Hedron thing. And of course, she also hooks up with Hart Bochner. You may remember him as Ellis from Die Hard. He's he plays Ethan, this landscaper who Faye Dunaway tries to cast a spell on, so he'll fall in love with her, and the spell doesn't end up working. He ends up falling in love with Helen Slater instead. I guess what was her character name was Linda Lee, I think is what she called herself. But anyway, so he falls in love with her, and finally, Faye Dunaway, she just ends up really becoming really bad. She builds a big mountain in the town of Midvale where they're all living, and she's running this sort of dictatorial regime there. She banishes Supergirl to the Phantom Zone. She finds Peter O'Toole there, and he helps her get out of the Phantom Zone. She gets back, and she takes down Faye Dunaway, and she saves the day. So there's the movie there. I think this is one that I think it could have been a lot better. I think, and I ended up saying, just to mention, I saw the the 2 hour and 4 minute version. That's kind of the main version that's out there now. So the version that was released in theaters was like 104 minutes. And I guess they found some of that old footage and they've released this new director's cut, this more full cut of the movie. And that's the one that's available when you rent it or whatever. Interesting enough, too, this is not available on Max. I had to rent it for $4 from my cable company, even though it's released by Warner Brothers. So I don't know why, even if Warner has the rights to it, why it's not included in Max with the other movies. So the other 5 of these Superman movies are all available on Max, but this one isn't. I'm not sure why that is. But anyway, so I was able to rent it. Yeah, I mean, again, the way that they wrote Helen Slater's character is very off. Like, there's times where she's got this childlike innocence to her. And then other times she's like this strong, heroic type. And again, it's something that I noticed in that first episode of the TV show. They did a better job mitigating, but it's uneven. And we just you don't know what to make of it. So when she's got this sort of childlike innocence to her, one, it makes it a little bit odd when she's suddenly being heroic and she's confronting, Selena and all of that. But the other thing is that when she has these romantic scenes with Hart Bochner, at the time, right, with her as a young adult, even though there is a bit of an age difference, it's not a huge age difference. I think it's like 6 or 7 years. It wouldn't have been horrible, right? It's not horrible that a guy in his like late 20s is hooking up with a young woman in her early 20s, right? That's not so awkward. But if she's in high school and he's in his 20s, it's weird, right? Like, that's just strange that that's happening there. And even if she's really not supposed to be a high schooler, but again, they play her sometimes like she's a high schooler, sometimes like not. So I think that was a weird thing. I think that was a weird touch that they had in the movie. And again, in the 80s, they didn't seem to think that stuff was as creepy as they probably should have. I mean, one of the big hits at that time, right, was Benny Mardones's "If I Could Fly," right? Which is, I think the opening line is, "She's just 16 years old," right? And it's like, okay, that's a big hit about this guy in his 30s having a thing for a 16-year-old. So yeah, I guess at that time they didn't think those things were as bad as they probably should have. And this movie just was playing on this weirdness, I mean, I have to assume there were plenty of people, though, that felt the way I did. That like, that's kind of odd. Like, that even as a kid watching it, it seemed like off that, like, this high school kid, was hooking up with Hart Bochner. But anyway, so there's that piece there. There are some interesting firsts for this movie. So I mean, obviously this is this is the first of DC's films to be helmed by a female superhero. I think that's a big piece. But also, obviously Marvel doesn't get into this until 86 technically. Right, their first big one is Howard the Duck, right? That's kind of their first one. So they're even like ways off from even doing these movies, let alone having a female star. Their first female lead is Elektra in 2005, but we don't see another female lead again until Catwoman in 2004. Which, less said about that one, the better. I think in terms of actually seeing this thing be successful, right? We see, Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, that it is possible to have successful movies with female leads, but you can also see, this movie, I think they really wanted this to be successful. I'm not saying that Catwoman or Elektra, they didn't want to be successful. I just don't think they put the effort into making those successful. Now, the stars did. Halle Berry was like all in on Catwoman, and I think again, the story is about her when she was accepting her Razzie award, right? That she brought her Oscar for Monsters Ball with her to accept the award. We know with Elektra, right, that Jennifer Garner really tried on that one, and that's part of the reason why I think it was important for her to be in Deadpool and Wolverine. She got to get some redemption for that character. So so there's that as well. But I think with Supergirl here, I mean, I think they were really kind of hoping to use her as use this as the launching pad for another series of movies. And when this doesn't work out, partly because of Warner Brothers pulling the plug, and then when TriStar, they release it, but the lesser version. But I mean, this movie, it's the only one to not make its budget back out of all the Superman movies. It's out of this series of Superman movies that we're talking about here. It's the only one that doesn't make its budget back. Even number 4, The Quest for Peace, right? It's got a 17. It's got a lower budget, I would say, but it did better than this movie. It made about $16 million more than this movie, and it had a budget of $17 million. It made $30 million. So it's the only one that did make its budget back. This is the one that makes the Salkinds sell the Superman property altogether. Like they just pull out completely after this. They're done, and that's when we get with number 4, The Quest for Peace. Right, it's Canon film. It's distributed by Warner, but it's a Canon film. That happens because of how poorly this movie does. So I think that's an important thing, again, to think about as well. Another first here, of course, is Faye Dunaway is the first female supervillain who's kind of solo or like the head supervillain in a theatrical feature film. So a couple of qualifiers there, right? Because obviously in the Batman motion picture, or the Batman movie from the TV show that comes out in the mid '60s, we've got Lee Merriweather as Catwoman, but she's kind of part of a team, right? So she's not like the one lone baddie. It's not based strictly around Catwoman, but rather all 4 of the baddies. So there's that there. And then with the Doctor Strange film that comes out, the TV movie that comes out in '78, that was supposed to be a pilot for a TV show, Jessica Walters plays a baddie. She's like kind of the first supervillain, female supervillain. Well, actually, not only is she the first female supervillain in a Marvel movie, but she's actually the first supervillain, I believe, in a Marvel film, because I don't think that any of the Marvel ones before that, the TV movies or whatever, I don't think they used a supervillain. I don't think they used anybody with superpowers. So Jessica Walters kind of has that double there. But I think the next time we get a supervillain, I think we get, obviously, Sharon Stone's character in Catwoman in '04. But really, then after that, I guess it's Cate Blanchett in Thor Ragnarok, right, in 2017. And I think that's a better comparison maybe than Sharon Stone, because if we think of Thor Ragnarok, right, where we have Cate Blanchett there, she's 5 years older than Faye Dunaway was in this movie. But the way they set Faye Dunaway up in this movie, it's kind of, I don't know, it's like, they make her look older than she is. I mean, it's like something like, it's like very like something out of like Sunset Boulevard, something like that, right? Like ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille. It's like that's really like kind of how she looks. So she's her hair and her makeup and everything, and the whole thing with like like she can't get a younger guy unless she plants a spell on him to make him want to love her. It just was all kind of hammy. Whereas on the other side, right, you've got Cate Blanchett in 2017, who's like about 5 years older than Faye Dunaway was here, in this skin-tight outfit, like totally badass and all of that stuff. And I do think I could see how Faye Dunaway, one of the reasons why they said that she was difficult, or that she may have been considered difficult, is I think she was getting annoyed with how much the parts were getting dried up for her in only her early 40s, right? And so she was already starting to see that as like something that she wasn't a fan of. And I'm sure she starts to see this part and thinks like, what is this? It's like, I mean, she's essentially playing the part that she plays 10 years later in the Into the Great Wide Open video. But they're having her play that part as a villain here. So I can see how that wouldn't have appealed to her, right? That why are you making me this character? Why can't you make me, you've got Helen Slater out here. I mean, that's the other thing too, is that there's like this vibe of like old versus new, right? That this idea that older women are somehow considered less than in our society. And here's Helen Slater as like the young heroine who's defeating this old woman, right? That who's causing all these problems. I could see like the whole thing didn't feel right. Like it didn't. I don't know. It was I totally get why she would have been upset with it. And I think just watching it now, it doesn't age well. She doesn't age well as a villain. A lot of the tropes and things like that they put into here, they're not good. And I don't know what I would have wanted for her as a villain if they were going to make her the villain. Because I think the fact that she is a female supervillain is a big enough deal. Because again, as we're talking about, we don't see this come up that often. Either they're part of a team of baddies, or they just, it's not there. Like if it's a female hero, she's fighting a male baddie, right? That there's a male super baddie. Like the Wonder Woman movies, right? She, in the first one she fights Ares, and in the second one she fights Cheetah, but she also fights Maxwell Lord? Is that his name? Something like whatever. Pablo Pascal's character was, but right, it's not a one head baddie, right? Like Cheetah's developing her powers, so even there, right, in Wonder Woman we don't get that, we don't get this kind of thing that we're getting here with Faye Dunaway as Selena. it would have been nice if maybe if instead of her being this witch kind of character, is if she was like somebody else from Krypton. If she escaped the Phantom Zone, right, the same way that Zod had. Interesting because the Ursa character was based off Feora, but they didn't actually use Feora in because the Ursa character in part 2 might have been based off of her, but they didn't actually use her. They could have used her here and maybe made her the baddie. So that's a possible. I don't know. That might have been a way around this as well. I think that, I mean, I don't know, because I think she was like, she was she was a Kryptonian, and right. The other thing, right, is that she hates men, right? She's like I guess I don't know if is that a bad thing too, to have, like, I guess maybe they could have toned the man hating part down a little bit, but anyway, I'm just saying, like, it for it being, for that kind of thing, for having, a female baddie like this in a movie, they played on a lot of bad tropes about aging women that I think just you didn't need to do. I think they could have avoided a little bit. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on here. At the same time, I mean, Helen Slater, I think, for all the unevenness of how the character was written, she is a believable Supergirl. I think that part of it I liked, and I would have liked to have seen more of that. Again, I think it shows you with the writing, because I think when I just watching one episode of the TV series and seeing how Melissa Benoist's character was much more evenly written and it comes off much better. I think it would have been nice if she had been a little bit more, either make it consistently that she's like the heroic type, that she's really going for it. I think also, too, the whole kind of childlike piece. It's weird if you're going to have her get into a relationship with Hart Bachner. Just maybe it's the mid '80s, right? Find a brat packer, just throw in a brat packer and have a relationship with him. I mean, James Spader played high school kids all throughout high school. And James Spader's roughly the same age as Helen Slater. I think they're like a couple years apart. So that's maybe the one. Get James Spader in there. He would have been great. Have him play a preppy high schooler, right, with the sweater tied, or whatever like that. It would have made more sense. It would have been a little bit easier, And I think, I don't know. It still would have been like the creepy element of Faye Dunaway's character wanting to hook up with him. But, you still could have had the stuff with Hart Bachner with Faye Dunaway and just not done it with Helen Slater's character. But I don't know. Either way, yes. But I do think it's an odd element of the movie that doesn't, go well. I mean, who knows? But that could be one of the reasons why Max doesn't have it now, is that there is that kind of that creepy, like, age element kind of piece there. So anyway, so there's that. What else we got? Oh, well, I mean, Popeye's chicken shows up in here, which, even though the whole thing is shot on Pinewood, the lot at Pinewood Studios in London, getting some Popeye's chicken for people outside the United States, you might not be familiar with Popeyes, because I think it might be a chain that's strictly a United States chain. I mean, where I grew up in Maine, we didn't have it in many places. We had it on the highway going from where I lived in the very southern tip of Maine north. On the rest area, you could get like, I think you get like Burger King, or you get Popeye's chicken there. So that was like the only place that I could get it growing up. But it since has kind of moved north a little bit. I mean, here in Philadelphia, the only fast food chain that exists predominantly is Popeye, at least in the Center City area, is Popeyes. So there's like one Wendy's, one Taco Bell, and then like 3 or 4 Popeyes in Center City, Philadelphia. The rest of the chains, McDonald's is out, Burger King's out. You don't see anything else there, but you see Popeyes. I mean, you've probably heard, Kentucky Fried Chicken, that's the one that is more international. Popeyes is like another level. I mean, their chicken sandwiches are just amazing. That's another company, Chick-fil-A, right, which is a little bit more problematic. I mean, for me, Popeyes chicken sandwiches are better than theirs. So it's just amazing. And so, yeah, it is kind of funny to see them, in the 80s there. And the other piece of Popeyes chicken for me as a baseball fan of especially the Boston Red Sox. The Boston Red Sox, they were, in 2011, they had put together this wagon of a team that it potentially could have been one of the best teams ever. They were talking about winning 100 games, which, 100 games out of 162. It sounds like it sounds crazy, but yeah, I mean, it seems like, a team should do that more often. But it's baseball's a weird sport. Like the best team still loses a third of their games, which is a really interesting concept, right? Because you think about like you watch international football, like the Premier League or something like that. Like those teams, like they lose maybe 2 or 3 games a year if you're the champion, right? You don't, but even the best team loses a third of their games. But anyway, this Red Sox team was coming in as like the best ever, and they had started off really great. They were doing really well, and one of the interesting things about baseball is that the batters and pitchers kind of live separately, or they kind of exist separately. And so the pitchers on the Red Sox, they'd started to kind of develop their own culture. And part of their routine was going to Popeyes and getting chicken and then drinking beer. So they became what they called the chicken and beer crew. And this was a common thing, that the Popeyes near Fenway Park, where the Red Sox play and train and all of that Popeyes had become very popular amongst them. Like they were all known to go there and get their chicken and beer. So anyway, they kind of get themselves out of shape. And as the season goes on, they start becoming less effective as pitchers, especially their star pitcher, Josh Beckett. Like he was I saw him pitch one game in September. And I thought he was doing pretty well. I was at the ballpark, and then when I watched it back, I saw that actually the ump was doing a bad job calling the balls and strikes. But anyway, I'm going along here. Yeah, so the Red Sox end up having one of the greatest collapses in pro sports history, where they were, or at least in American pro sports, where they were ahead by a lot of games going. They were well ahead of the second place team in their division going into September. And no team that was that far ahead going into September had ever lost their division before. And not only did they lose the division, they didn't even make the playoffs at all. It was the biggest collapse, I think, in the history of the sport. And that they were known as the chicken and beer crew, and it was Popeye's chicken that felled them. So even though I'm a huge fan of Popeye's chicken and I love them, I have to admit that yes, they ended what could have been a really popular, really big season for my team. Now, granted, they had the next year in 2012, which was a huge debacle, where they got this manager, Bobby Valentine, was a complete mess. The whole thing was just a complete mess. And then in 2013, they won the World Series. So I only had a little bit more than a year to have to deal with that pain of that loss for them to turn around and win the World Series after anyway. So you have to feel so bad for me. But anyway, I appreciated seeing Popeye's chicken in this. But again, right, these young women from the local boarding school are hanging out at Popeye's Chicken, and here's Jimmy Olsen hanging out with them. And it's like, Jimmy Olsen's like, I don't know how old he's supposed to be, because he's got a job and he's working at the Daily Planet. Even if he skipped high school, which I know he does make a joke in the Superman 3, right, when they talk about the reunion, right? He's like, well, most of my friends are still in high school. So he does make a joke that he's that young, right? So it's not so bad. It's not as bad as Hart Bachner, right, hooking up with high school kids. That's not the same kind of level of bad. But it is still a little bit like, okay, you're out of high school and you're hanging out with high school kids and hooking up with them. Because he ends up hooking up with Lucy Lane. And I don't know. And yes, I get that, like, maybe, a year or two when Lucy Lane's character, when she's out of high school, it's suddenly not so bad. And it's just an odd way, it's an odd construction at this, or odd part of our society, maybe. I don't know if I'd say odd, though, right? I don't know if odd's the right term. It's just a part of our society that, if you're in high school and somebody's out of high school, it's a little bit odd, right? That somebody out of high school is dating somebody in high school. But it is still kind of a weird thing, and so it's like, Jimmy Olsen, you've got a career. You're working as a photographer at the Daily Planet, taking pictures of Superman. Do you really need to be dating Lois Lane's high school sister? It just seems weird. And again, in the TV series, they completely take that element out. When Jimmy Olsen goes to the Tribune or whatever the newspaper is that Supergirl's working at, right? Everybody's adults. They're all adults, as Steven Dorff says in his blue cigarette commercials. We're all adults here, and so you get none of that weirdness there. So it's just one of those things when you're watching the movie, you're like, okay, Jimmy Olsen, yeah, you're cool. You're Mr. Daily Planet photographer who's hanging out with high school kids. So anyway, but they were hanging out at the Popeye, so I like that. I mean, the other thing too is that Popeye scene leads into this big destructive thing where when Faye Dunaway is putting the spell on Hart Bachner, he escapes and he ends up in town in Midvale near the heart of town where the Popeyes is, and he's like wandering all over the place, and you get this sort of like whole like opening to Superman 3 kind of, cars are trying to avoid him and they're crashing into things and things are crashing into that. But then also, right, like I think Faye Dunaway controls a big front end loader and scoops Hart Bachner up into that. And so then Supergirl eventually has to save all that. But it's like Supergirl takes her sweet time. Like she's just hanging out in Popeyes, watching all this carnage ensue, and finally decides like, oh, maybe I should don my Supergirl outfit and save the day, And I guess an original version of this, somebody dies in this whole catastrophe that's happening here, which is interesting because they cut the part out that somebody died, but it was kind of like, you're taking your sweet time here, Supergirl. And I think it was kind of a frustrating thing to watch because she's going to put on her Supergirl outfit and save the day, but it just takes them forever to get to it. So there were little things like that in this movie also that didn't work either. So I don't know. Some of the other things that were, I think the other big piece of this is that the outfit that they designed for Helen Slater in this movie becomes the Supergirl outfit. So prior to that, there was an outfit where she had like a headband and hot pants. And now this one with no headband and the skirt, that's the one that's been used, and that's the one that they go with in the new series as well. That's kind of just taken over as that. So it's kind of another similar thing that similar to with the first movie where Marlon Brando's suggestion of them using the Superman logo as their family crest becomes canon and part of the actual story. This outfit, this design. Now, granted, they also killed Supergirl off pretty soon after. I think it's like Crisis of Infinite Earths crossover series. I think they kind of do away with her soon after this as well. So they use this as her outfit. Then she's or maybe it was like they brought her back and they brought her back with that outfit. I can't remember because it's comic books. Nobody ever really dies in comics, right? You just find all these different ways to bring people back. So anyway, but I know as I'm kind of wrapping up here, there is a sense that they're going to make a new Supergirl, or not even a sense that it's planned that they're going to make a new Supergirl for like in 2026. And James Gunn has said he wants this to be like a darker version of it, where she had this sort of darker origin story, where she kind of just is like on this lonely planet outside of Krypton that she's sort of isolated there and all of that. And so it'll be interesting to see how that works. It's going to be interesting to see just how James Gunn handles all of this stuff because, right, the new Superman's supposed to come out next year, and then, the Supergirl's supposed to come out in 2026. How all of these are going to connect, how this is all going to work together because there was an opportunity here, I think, at least with Part 3, and going into this movie to have really done something special with all of the DC characters. Whether the Salkinds have the rights to them or not, I don't know. But I think they could have gone bigger with both of these movies and made something nicer. And it wouldn't have cost as much money. The other thing I think that's important that I think we've learned now when it comes to these kinds of things, but I think we learned it even with the Batman series, is that yes, maybe the budget in terms of special effects can be difficult, right? And that costs a lot of money. But adding characters doesn't cost a lot more money. And adding characters is a great way to punch up a script to make something more interesting without a lot of... we're seeing it with the Deadpool and Wolverine movie, right? That yes, it does have a pretty sizable budget. What is it, like over $200 million? Or I don't know. Actually, they didn't get to $200 million for that one, did they? I don't think they quite spent that much. Because Deadpool, right? Nobody wants to give Deadpool that much money. So I can't remember. So it was 200. It was 200 even. Okay. But yeah, so but that's still a lot less than the Marvels. It's less than Guardians of the Galaxy that it's doing better than. Black Panther, Wakanda. It's less than a lot of movies, and part of it is because you're just adding a bunch of characters, and just keep adding a bunch of characters. That's always a lot of fun. I say that I'm earlier saying that the Marvels, right, screwed up by having too many characters, and they were diluting Brie Larson's, Captain Marvel character. I think you could do it both ways, but yeah, and I don't know what I would have done with Supergirl beyond this. I think the right move would have been to introduce her in Superman 3. I think that was something that I think would have been better. I think when you found out you couldn't get Christopher Reeves because he was supposed to have a cameo in this, and then he doesn't. When you find out you can't get Christopher Reeves, what if you could have gotten Linda Carter? Just what if you could have gotten her? And if you couldn't get the rights to Wonder Woman, what if you could have gotten her as, another, maybe some other superhero character that, that you put, that would have been interesting. Again, it would have been kind of fun to see Wonder Woman in these movies. I would keep trying to push that, but it's an area that these movies didn't go that I would have liked to have seen. So We'll see. I mean, again, if you're somebody who's watching these and you're binging them, you could get by without doing this one, but I don't think you should skip it. I think the other problem, of course, is if you're subscribed to Max and you're just watching these through your subscription, right? This is when you have to rent. Though technically you have to rent the Donner cut too, if you want to do the Donner cut as opposed to the other cut. You would have to rent that too. So that is part of it, but. I mean, this Supergirl movie, it's not included in any box sets of the Superman films. So it's really not considered one of the movies, even though it is, especially since they didn't spin this off into more Supergirl movies. It still belongs as part of the franchise in my mind, at least. And I think, again, it's one that when you watch them in this sort of this collection of 1, 2, and 3, and then this one, it is one of those senses when you see 1 and 2 and you're like, oh, look at how good 1 and 2 are. And then you watch these ones and you're like, oh, why didn't you do some of the things you did in 1 and 2? It definitely it hurts when it's in that context. I don't know, though. I don't know that Supergirl has the same kind of appeal that Superman 3 has if you watch it as a one-off without watching the rest of the movies. Again, I like Helen Slater's Supergirl. I think it's kind of too bad that she didn't get to do more with this character. I think it would have been interesting to see if they had greenlighted a sequel to this with better writers and a more coherent plot and a better, a better written villain. I'm not saying it's Faye Dunaway's fault the villain was bad, but I think they just wrote this villain as just like a, old lady tropes. That's the best way to say it. And I think it's just, it didn't become her at all. I mean, again, she was only in her early 40s. It's not like she was, and even if she was older, like old lady tropes in movies, it's just not good anyway. But I think they could have done better with that. I think it would have been. It's a shame she never quite got a chance to do it again. Now I will say she plays the adopted she plays Melissa Benoist's adopted mother in Supergirl. So she has like a small part. So it's kind of fun that she kind of comes back and gets to at least have a part in it. Also, Dean Cain plays her husband in that. So it is kind of nice that the two of them get a little bit of I feel like it's not redemption in that case, but more like acknowledgement of things that came before. And so. Yeah, I guess that was kind of a nice piece. But yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of seeing if there's anything else that I've missed here. I think what happened in the previous segment was I skipped past my notes on the Lois Lane piece there. But I think I kind of covered everything I wanted to on this one. So yeah, and I know the Hart Bochner aspect of it is fascinating that it's the guy who, Hans baby, from Die Hard, which I'm thinking about doing the Die Hard series next. So I guess we're not going to go too long. You're not going to go for too long of a break from Hart Bochner. Hart Bochner will be back in a couple, not a couple, I guess in a month or so. The next couple episodes, you'll see some more Hart soon. But yeah, I guess this is a good place to wrap this one up here. So, hey, it's just me this week, so we'll do some plugs. My newest novel, Don's House in the Mountains, available on Kindle Unlimited, and in paperback. Always appreciative if somebody wants to pick that up. The site, of course, dtvconnoisseur.blogspot.com. That's where you can go see all of our blog posts there, all of our reviews. Actually, I don't remember. I think I did Supergirl at one time. I forgot about that. I think I covered Supergirl and Superman 4 on the site. So interesting that I'm just remembering that now. But yeah, so you could definitely go to the site and check out those as well. That was back when I used to do those wildcard posts. And so I think there's a bunch of comic book movies I did wildcard posts on, and Supergirl is one of them for sure. So yeah, you can definitely check that out. But yeah, why don't we wrap it up here? Thank you, everybody, for listening. And yeah, we'll be back soon. In 2 weeks, you can check us out for the conclusion of this look at the Superman series. And then, of course, on Tuesday, a new episode of the DTVC podcast, the main podcast, will release then. But thank you all for listening, and we'll talk soon. Bye, everyone.